I know we're going to open up to the audience, but I thought maybe I'll get the first question so all of you can sort of think questions. I'm going to buy you a little time to think of some great questions for our panel, but I think what I'll do is we'll have to share a mic, I guess. Okay. This is open to anyone, but maybe I'll start with you, Firdaus. You know, we talk a lot about stigma, and I know that sometimes we use that word, and in reality, it really is more than stigma. It's discrimination in many cases. But there's a lot of things out there to try and reduce stigma. But what can we all do to reduce? Like, what can everybody in the audience do and go away with to try and help eliminate the stigma around mental illness?
It's a great question, Chris. I think it starts with meaningful dialogue. I think it really starts with that. I think it's being compassionate and being caring human beings, right? If you don't see someone else as a person with mental illness, you see them as a human being, right? They shouldn't be labeled by their illness, you know? So I think that's really what we can take away, is that we understand that this is a disease and that there's a myth, really. People think that mental illness is just a sign of weakness and they choose to be that way. So there's all these myths that we have to break down. But if we see that this is a disease, which it is, just like cancer is, and show compassion and empathy and be there for support, I think that's a role that we can all play. It's an easy role that we can all play and something that we can all take away. Another big thing is that, as I mentioned, is that we're all advocates. You know, we all have a stake in this. All the hands went up when Yusuf asked if anyone knows someone struggling with a mental illness. We all have mental health, so we all play a role, and that, I think we're all advocates, because at any day it could be someone else that's struggling. It could be you, right? So you'd want to be treated the same way that you are now, even though if you have an illness or not.
Okay. Excellent. Anyone else wanted to jump in on that one, or?
I'd like to add to that a little bit as well. I think for specific communities, I think it's all about language too, right? Like sometimes we'll say things just flippantly in terms of people who are struggling with mental health issues, and we don't even realize the conversations we're having, but you don't know who's listening, right? You don't know what somebody is struggling with. So when you say words that maybe aren't the best words to describe somebody who's having a mental illness, people are picking up on that, and you're basically sending them the message, don't talk to me about it, and to judge you for having any issues that you might have. So I think it's very important that we all try to be really conscious of the words that we say and hold people to task for things that they also say, right? Don't just let certain things slide. And there's always ways of approaching it. It's not to say you need to embarrass that person, but maybe when you have a moment, you can just pull them aside and say, just so you know, I was uncomfortable with that comment, and you know how loaded those words are that you're saying. I think that can go a little bit of a ways to kind of helping to challenge some of the stigma that we see in certain communities. Yeah.
You grabbed the mic, so did you want to weigh in, Joseph?
I think it's important also to educate ourselves. I mean, what Firdaus said, yeah, about like the empathy and like having the meaningful dialogue and all these other, I think educating ourselves is also important. Obviously, not everybody has that opportunity, but I think we can all educate ourselves in the sense that find out what our elected representatives are doing. You know, how much money is being spent at the at the municipal level or at the provincial level or at the federal level on mental illness. Like, we need to, be involved in that capacity, whichever we can be. I mean, those funding opportunities and these programs, they can go a long way in bringing more resources versus not more resources, right? And I think that's very important as well. Like, what Firdaus and Keisha said is more important, but I think this plays a role in terms of, keeping our elected representatives to account of, okay, what are you going to do in this election, or, when it comes to mental illness or mental health.
Okay, thank you. Do we have any questions from the floor? Anyone? Oh, sorry, we'll go up here.
So this is from online. Okay. What role should employers play when assisting staff who need mental health?
I guess I can start and then you jump in. I just think, I think in society we've come a long way with human rights and people with physical challenges. We know how to, businesses are pretty adept at putting in accessible washrooms and elevators and all those things. They don't know how to handle mental health accommodation. And it could be that somebody just needs a quiet room for a short time, or I know businesses face challenges. If you give people accommodation, other workers see it, well, why are you slacking off? Why are you giving him time? But I'd be curious from your perspective, like how can we convince those business organizations to understand and make accommodations for people with mental illness?
Well, again, outside of a human issue, there's a whole economic case for it. There's about, I think, 42.3 billion loss due to absenteeism, presenteeism, unemployment. So people struggling with mental illness, 500,000 in any given week won't attend work. So that's a cost to the business. So there's that business case. If they're not going to get it from a human compassion side, it's good for their business. You know, if they have employees showing up and are adequate workers and they have the benefits and the systems put in place, it's going to be worthwhile for them as well. And something similar is like if you have a slip and fall at work, you know, there's coverage for that. And that's, you know, workplace safety. But there's no psychological healthy safety standard. We have created a standard. It exists, but workplaces aren't mandated to follow it. So how do we make sure that they are mandated to make sure that they implement a psychologically healthy safety workplace? And that's question that we've been working on, and something that slowly some organizations are getting it because they see the economic case, but there's still a ways to go.
Great. I think there was a question down here at the front row.
Yes. Yes, sir. Okay. Straight to the gentleman. I have a question to Chris.
Okay, yeah.
Talking about this, Nada, that was shown back in the channel, the English cheese. Or the crime connect, supposed to do some crime, and after go to the virtual hospital.
So it's my father. His question is so. His question is, why is, and it's to Chris or perhaps Firdaus can answer this. Like, why is someone with mental illness? Their understanding is that if you have to commit a crime to be able to have opportunities to go to Ontario shores. That's so.
Yeah, that's, you don't have to. Our forensic program is one aspect of what we do at Ontario Shores, and it is people that come through the courts. But we do have general psychiatry, adolescent, different programs, both voluntary and involuntary. It's unfortunate, you know, I guess 1/3 of our beds are forensic, and it's unfortunate that for many people, their first entry into the door of mental health care is through the criminal justice system. And there's a lot of reasons for that. There's just, again, a lack of resources, there's stigma, that, you know, all sorts of things that, again, I talked about being proactive, you know, for many years, untreated, and then that's the first door they come through. And some people that suffer from mental illness don't want to get help, and we can't force our loved ones to access care, even though as a parent we know our child may be suffering, unless they're willing to. But yeah, I mean, just to go back to your question, you don't have to commit a crime to come to our hospital for care. The forensic mental health system is that one aspect of it, but that's not all we do.
But Chris, it's almost as if like you have to go, and I'm sorry to say this, but like go out of your way to get into the system. Like, and I'm sorry to say this because, like, I don't know who the source is, but I believe it was the Ontario Human Rights Commissioner. Like, for example, there's only one hospital in the entire province that, you know, there's this external hospital in, like, where people that are involved in the incarceration system that have mental illness, and I think this is in Smith Falls or somewhere in that area. Like, and I think that's a problem. That's a significant problem. And you know, Ontario Shores is doing an incredible job. You know, there's no argument there, but it's like, it's as if like there isn't enough Ontario Shores, right? There isn't like enough of, because it's an amazing job that they're doing, but it's almost like you have to go out of your way to get into that system.
Well, sure. I mean, it's, yeah, and I think we can all probably speak, and you addressed it as well as, you know, mental health funding is we're underfunded, right? When you look at the disease burden, we don't get the funding, so there's a huge demand for inpatient, outpatient community services, you know, and we have to all come together and figure out how do we work with existing resources. You know, one of the things that you mentioned, sorry, was very, very poignant was, you know, I think OHIP covers psychiatry, right? That's the one profession that you get medication. And we know that getting to people earlier is important, but we don't provide funding or free access to counselors or therapists. And we know most mental illnesses start at a young age, and we don't invest in trying to get to that point. You know, to your point, yeah, there are waiting lists, and there's not enough, and it's tough to get access. And you know, I wish I had a magic solution to how we figure that out. But we definitely, I think, can build a better system that helps with that. But I think we have to advocate and be strong advocates for what's needed for the most marginalized community. Sorry, did you have?
Yeah, I'll just add to that. I think that's a really good point, because a lot of the families that I met in the courts, they had reached a point with their, I say child, but of course they were adults, you know, where they were like, please help, because we cannot help. And I don't know what the path was, you know, to lead them there. Of course, part of it is, you know, you cannot force someone to seek treatment. You can't. But that's one factor. But I don't know if they had tried in the past and either like doors were closed on them or they couldn't find the right services, and who knows. But I cannot tell you how many families, you know, were just desperate for the courts to solve their child's issue. And they said, please don't send them back home to us because we don't know how to manage them. And it was out of love. I mean, and this was not in keeping with the stats that I pointed out today about, you know, people that might, you know, be homeless and things like that. These were people coming from families that were, that appeared to be relatively stable in terms of, I mean, at least having loving parents there for them, you know, with secure housing and all the rest of it, and seemed to be financially able to assist. But, you know, you have to wonder what happened to that child, like all through the sort of their younger years and so on, and at the point of maybe starting to show signs and symptoms of the mental illness. I think that's a very good point, that psychotherapy and counseling is not funded. At least I shouldn't say it's not funded, but to what extent it's funded for the broader population, I think is questionable.
Can I?
Sorry, go ahead. You go first.
Just to add on to that as well, a lot of times, like as a frontline worker, when you're out there in the community and you're trying to get people the supports, you're taking them to hospital, you're going to the emergency rooms when people are in crisis, you're there. They get assessed quickly, then released. Then maybe if somebody is in hospital and they stay for a couple of days, then released. And then this pattern, it just keeps going on and on and on. And then the families just get to that point of frustration. Plus the people kind of get jaded too, right? Like every single time you go, nothing happens, you get released and you're not getting the help that you need, right? And so it gets to a boiling point. And that's when people start to look to the criminal justice system to say maybe this is the one desperate way that they can try to get the support and help that they need for their family. People get desperate, right, when it comes to it's life or death, right? So people do kind of do what they feel they need to do to save their family members.
Yeah, and to build off that point, we say Canada has a universal healthcare system and that we're proud of it and we should be proud of, but it's not really a universal healthcare system, it's a universal medical system. So you have to be in crisis before anyone will usually intervene, you know? So why is that the fact? We don't do that when it comes to cancer. We don't wait until people are at stage 4 cancer to intervene and be like, okay, now we need to help you. We need to intervene earlier and before it becomes a crisis, before someone is clinically diagnosed with depression. How do we get to them earlier and get them to the community so they're not going to the hospitals, so they're not going through police and first responders? That's the key, is to make sure that we funnel those funds early on into community level so that people can access it there and not have to wait a ridiculous amount of times.
Agreed. Sorry, I have a question.
I just want to start with that. Questions will come right afterwards, but I want to thank all the speakers for your Shoshana, for your incredible stories, and for your expertise. I'm very actually give you the call down the mic.
Oh, I'm sorry. There's a mic up front. I'm sorry. Sorry.
Yes, I just want to thank all the speakers and the on stage and Shoshana for your incredible stories and for your expertise. So I'm a high school teacher and I work with students, some of whom, you know, suffer from mental health issues. So my question is, and maybe some of the experts up there can tell me, but in the event of a crisis, a mental health crisis at home, for example, or at school, we know that most times the first responders are police, and the police we know are not the most well equipped to deal with some of these situations. So do you know if EMS personnel are trained and equipped to be the first responders in situations like what we have heard? And maybe there could be some work or lobbying to have legislation so that when we have a mental health situation or crisis, the first responders are not necessarily police. They can come as a support, but it should be mental health or peer personnel who are trained in mitigating and dealing with mental health situations. Thank you.
I think we all agree. No, I think speaking to, the mobile mental health units are a good concept. Even though police are attached to it, it'll have a psychiatric nurse, social workers, and those officers are trained as well. And I agree. We've seen sentinel incidents where police show, and you can tell that person doesn't have any training. And we just don't have enough mobile mental health units. Some police forces have them, some don't. And we see, sort of situations go bad when they're not trained, and it's not the best situation. So, I think those are good ideas. Maybe the panel has some other ideas how we, who could be the first response in situation of crisis beyond police.
Well, what about a radical idea? How about a psychologist at the high school? Mandating that, making sure that we have someone staff that can address that, right? Physical education, and we have a course for you go out there and do some activities and whatnot. What about a course or some sort of Asian, and we have a course for you go out there and do some activities and whatnot? What about a course or some sort of educational tool for mental health to help people navigate their emotions, to build resiliency, to understand what it is to be struggling some days and what it's not? So again, we have to intervene earlier. It's too bad that we're waiting until people are in crisis, and we're waiting until people are at that tipping point that we say, okay, now we might try to help you, but we're not getting to them earlier. And that's the key, is to how to get to them earlier and teach them those lessons and those tools, because they exist, and it's how do we get that to be part of the curriculum.
Actually, I'm able to sort of answer some of those questions. I am a school social worker for the Durham Public Board, and I'm proud to say that we are really moving on mental health in terms of there's provincial mandates on how to lead mentally healthy schools. In my master's degree in University of Georgia, I had a policy in relation to a crisis. I will give everyone a perfect mark in this assignment in this class. And no one can ever find that. She does that from year to year. There is never any policy that is done sort of out of the benevolent inside of people of we need to do this. So I think we have to decide that it's time to mobilize, and this might be the crisis in mental health where we're not going to have Chris defend why Ontario Shores can't take enough people, why people have to go to the legal route. We all have to decide this is the crisis, and this is where we're going to mobilize to advocate for these needs. So I'm proud that I'm a school social worker, because when I think about youth, I think about looking at that, like the whole evolution of their life. I look at their family history and I'm like, are these the early signs of a mental health condition? Whoa, I better make sure this child and their family know what they're potentially looking at, and know that if they are going to leave school early, I've got to make sure that they're triaged to the right system. I saw Professor Haley Hamilton from KMH who was talking about the fact that through public awareness, tobacco use among young people has dropped. It's a whole generation. My kids think smoking is gross. And why does grandpa smoke? Because he got addicted at a very early age. And so similarly, we can bring public awareness and public education to young people about mental health, well-being, so that they'll know, okay, removing stigma, treating people appropriately, helping friends and family get to services before they're at that crisis point. So I'm actually a little bit optimistic because I can see that change coming through with the way that the province is dealing with it. I mean, politically, some things have changed, so I know our board is trying to continue with the same plans, even though the funding is held and cut and, you know, on wait, but I hope that we can move forward on some of these things for the next generation.
I think one thing that's happening locally, and I think is a great concept, and it did start from police, is Durham Connect. And it's really a novel concept. I don't know why we didn't think about it. So we have a table where everybody comes together, educators, mental health, police, social services. And what they do is they sit around the table and they bring a serious event that they're dealing with. And it's funny when someone will come and say, I've got a child that's missing school, and then someone else will pipe in and say, I know that. The dad is dealing with an addiction issue or violent issue. And so what they do is they find all the connects to that family and they do a door knock intervention with everybody. Because when you think about a situation at home, it's not just one thing. So a kid might be missing school, but then you find out there was sexual abuse or there's things going on. And if we as providers come together and figure out how to wrap around and support people, I think that's another concept that we should be focused on as well.
I think that's great. I think that's actually a brilliant idea, because back to what I was sort of talking about, just in my experience with the clients that I dealt with, is that I don't think they had a community. And so you can talk about community, you know, ethnic community or even just physical community, but it's rare, I think, for people to like do a door knock, as you're saying. So I think that's actually a really brilliant idea, because you have to get through to that person. That person is probably not going to reach out and say, oh, I need help, especially if he or she is 16 years old and is living with a parent who has a substance abuse issue. That's not easy. So that's really great. I think that's a great program.
I have another question from online.
Sure.
With mental health first interactions defaulting to emergency services, what recommendations do you have specifically for fire services first contact with a person in mental distress?
Well, there's training available. There's mental health first aid training that there's options available for them to get trained. It should be part of their onboarding and their learning. And something that Sally mentioned around is we also have to understand first responders' mental health, you know, so especially paramedics and firefighters, they're the first people on site for whatever they see. It's traumatic. So we have to understand that their mental health needs also need to be taken care of, because we hear stories a lot about paramedic suicide rates, so people in the paramedic field increasing and at an alarming rate. So we have to understand that their mental health needs need to be addressed. But there are training available, and I think there's other ways of getting first responders trained, but it's also making sure that they have someone with them that they can go and address these things. It's not their duty, you know, to be the experts on it. There are people out there that have been relegated to the sidelines that are better positioned to help. So how do we have this integrated system? So it's not first responders here, mental health here. It's how do we integrate those two and make sure that that's our response. And it's not us working in silos, because we've been doing that for years, and it's enough of that.
And I think beyond training, I actually sit on the OPP mental health strategy, and I always wonder, and this is more police maybe than fire, but we can do all sorts of training that we want, but I always wonder, what is that person bringing to a call from their own personal perspective? So when I see issues in the States where police are involved in racial issues, I wonder, is that a lack of training, or do they see that person in a different light? So, you know, or as a human being, and same, you know, with your brother, what is the mental perspective they're bringing to that situation? And I think we need to ensure that, you know, like in policing, we're just not hiring the tough guys. We want people on the front lines that are empathetic, that, you know, and I think part of it is, you know, often first responders see people at their worst. And I want them to see that person that they may have dealt with in their worst and how productive they are as a citizen, see them as human beings. Because I think empathy and that perspective is so important when you're addressing someone in crisis and how you see that person. No, you probably not.
I think empathy is important, but I think there also has to be like a shift in culture too, in the sense of like accountability. Like I'll tell you the example of my late brother. Like his interaction with the police was very good. Actually, the police, in the 11 year, but it took, there wasn't any issue, to be frankly honest. But then it was night and day, and then. I think the shift in culture is also important in the sense that, and I'm not trying to generalize, but you look at some of the tragedies that are happening here in the United States with certain individuals' interaction with law enforcement. The accountability is, unfortunately, it's lacking. I'm sorry to say that. There needs to be more of this accountability, that if you do something, the Ashley Smith tragedy. Everybody know who Ashley Smith, the young woman in which the guards, who had a mental illness, they watched her die. This was 11 years ago. This tragedy, and there's many other tragedies, where is the accountability? I think there has to be that shift as well. We're still not there, in my opinion.
We have another question from online, from Facebook, and this is for Keisha. It is from Akua, one of our community members. Do you feel, and most of you spoke about racism, do you feel the act of carding contributes to the mental health of the Black community and other people of color in a negative way? Why or why not?
I absolutely do think the act of carding contributes to negative health outcomes and negative mental health outcomes for people, especially within the Black community. A lot of these communities are over-policed, and a lot of times when the police are looking for things, they will try to find the things that they're looking for. And if you're always positioned as being a criminal, even if you're not. When you're stopped and asked questions and you don't necessarily know your rights in terms of not answering the questions, and you feel like your life is in jeopardy if you don't, to always feel that way, to always have those pressures on you, it would definitely impact your mental health in a negative way. And it doesn't just start with the carding, it starts from the schools, right? It starts from junior kindergarten all the way through these lowered expectations and a lot of different things that Black youth are having to contend with, definitely impacting their mental health in terrible and sometimes devastating ways.
Maybe I'll ask this question. I want something positive. Do you think, with young people today, I know when I went to school, we used to sort of segregate kids that have different disabilities and things like that, and now schools seem more inclusive. Are you optimistic that the youth of today will be less stigmatizing and understand mental illness down the road, that the future generation get it better than we do? Anyone?
I think for certain illnesses, yes. I think that there seems to be an understanding amongst young people more about anxiety and what that looks like. There seems to also be more of an understanding around certain eating disorders, I'm finding. But when it comes to, depending on which illness it is and depending on what the symptoms of that is, I don't necessarily think that there's been that much leaps and bounds made for young people. I think there's still a ways to go.
Yeah, we've chipped away at the stigma, so people are coming out and reaching out and asking for help. But the issue is the system ready to respond? Do it, but is the system responding back? And I think youth have, because they've been empowered and they have their voice found, so they've really rallied around each other, and there's still a lot of work to be done there, but it's because of stigma reduction and some sort of need for us to now be inclusive, not to be inclusive, but to support one another. And that's slowly changing. I think there's still ways to go, sadly.
Any other questions from the audience at all? Or? I'm going to ask you a political hot question. So, people that suffer from severe mental illness, we know about 70-80% are unemployed. A lot of them are on ODSP. Do you think because of that they're not respected as far as funding, as citizens, for equity and funding, because it's rare that if someone has cancer, they may be a millionaire in hospital, but most of the people suffering from mental illness are on social supports and maybe don't get the same consideration when it comes to political or funding support?
I think, it's a very political question. It's a two-frontal thing here to keep in mind. Like, it's first and foremost, it's not for some folks, it's not a politically sexy subject. When it comes to mental illness, like it's like, oh, put it here on the side, and let's forget about it. Like, it doesn't invoke the same kind of level of passion, like education or certain other fields. Like, it doesnn't invoke it. And so I think there's this idea that it's not like a political sexy subject, which in actuality it's so critical and important to have. And I think the other thing is, and this is my perspective, is that there's a fundamental gap between individuals that are incarcerated with mental illness and the respective societies. So it's like the gap, so like people are almost don't have an opportunity to be compassionate because they're like closed off. It was like, oh, you know what, they deserve to be there. Like, some of the questions I often get at other people asking like with respect to mental illness, like, oh, why, what did they do? Like, there's like, it's the political subject. I think in addition to the fact that, like, when people have mental illness and they're incarcerated, they're not in community. We talked about community belonging, but they're not involved with the respective society. So everybody thinks, well, you know what, whatever happens to them, that they, because the level of, like, I would call, in my opinion, like threshold that we hold for people that, are incarcerated versus someone who's outside, but then when they suffer from mental illness, there's a gap. I mean, why is it, for example, like this fact, why is it that 1 in 3 women that are in prison are First Nations? I mean, why is that? Why is it, or that, folks from certain communities, like, like the Afro-Caribbean community, are disproportionately higher, like, in the incarceration system? Right? Like, I mean, I think, again, there's a gap, in my opinion.
Yeah, to speak on that gap too a little bit, this federal government has shown unprecedented leadership with investment of $5 billion over 10 years into mental health, and we have to applaud that. And the issue with that is, though, it's been years and years of chronic underfunding in the mental health system. So it's not going to take one sitting government or one budget to fix that issue. So my fear is mental health is a main topic right now for discussion. What happens when we don't have that as a hot topic anymore? That's my fear. If we're not getting it what we need right now, what happens when it's no longer the hot topic, right? So we have to really push right now when the iron is hot, and strike while the iron is hot, is to make sure that we all have this one unified voice. And that's something that we're working at CMHA, is to get parity into legislation. So regardless of what government is sitting, that there's certain legislation put in place that no matter what happens, this amount of dollars will be dedicated to mental health, and it will never be lower than that. So that's a key step for us, is to advocate at the government level.
We're doing 5 more. Any other questions from the audience right now? I'm going to ask. I came from the media, so I'm probably to blame too. So you can blame me, but how do we change? I mean, it seems like media respond to headlines of sentinel events, and they'll cover sort of the blood and guts of stories, but they never look into the human side, the recovery, the good stories of what people become and not be defined by their illness. What can we do as society to encourage media or to change that landscape?
I think, just as we've been talking, and one thing that Firdaus mentioned, presenteeism, which I'm familiar with that term, but I think that should be a more common term. I'm not sure if everyone knows what that means, but it's like when you're there, but you're not there, because your mental health is not at its best that day. And I think, in answer to your question, not that, I have the solution, but I think one thing is that mental health is everyone's issue, right? So it's like, it fluctuates, goes up and down. Everyone has bad days, bad weeks, bad months, traumatic experiences in their life, low points in your life. Like, everyone has that. But I think there is this us and them thing with mental health, where it's like, well, those are the really sick people. That's not me, or that's not my family. So I think that if everyone works on bridging that gap, that would help to say, well, that could be me, or that could have been me, because the brain is so fragile in that way. I don't know. I think that that's one way that we can sort of try to understand each other a bit better and not have this gulf between those really sick people that like we may not want to talk about today or help today because, well, there's such a drain on the system and yeah, ODSP and all these different things. And it's like, it's really easy to keep them over there on that island where we don't live. We live in this productive place where we go to work every day and get up and, you know, shower and whatever you have to do to get on with your day. But there's some people that can't do that every day. But it's like the day that that happens to you or your family or someone close to you, then you get it. And you see these advocates in the mental health sector who have been personally touched, and they sort of become these, you know, giants that can speak for these voices. But I think everyone can do that if they really try hard enough.
Yeah, on the media guidelines, I think we've come a long way with how media portrays mental illness now, but there's still a ways to go, and it's more to what Keisha matter. Words matter, you know, so sometimes I still hear it within the sector, and that's fine. There's a need for education, but people don't commit suicide. You know, they die by suicide. Committing is a crime, right? So suicide is the final symptom of a mental illness. So that's key, is to understand that words, and you hear it in the media still. You know, there's guidelines, work with community organizations who've created these wonderful guidelines that they can use to do that, but you're perpetuating the stigma when you're using that kind of words, right? Or calling someone an addict, you know, like they have a substance use disorder. This is an illness, you know, this is not a character flaw. You know, this is not something someone chose to have. This is a disease, and it needs to be portrayed like that in media because media has so much access to people.
Great. I think we're wrapping up. But
Sorry, I have to ask this. I know we've had a tough conversation, but perhaps we can end it on a good note. Can any of you speak on a campaign, an initiative taken by the public sector or the private sector, a nonprofit, or a campaign that has worked, that other municipalities can emulate, that a nonprofit could emulate, anything that has worked, any initiatives or policies that you know of?
We can start with stigma reduction. CMHA has Get Loud for Mental Health Week, 67 years that we've been running it, and year after year we see an increase in schools who turn green and teach their children, teach the students to talk about mental health. So there's the stigma reduction bell, Let's Talk, has done some great work on reducing the stigma. I think it comes back to publicly funding therapies, making sure that it's available. Like corporate Canada has even stepped up. Starbucks has increased their funding to $10,000 for psychological services. But you shouldn't have to be a barista at Starbucks to get access. Everyone should have that access. So corporate Canada has led a little bit, you know, but it's everyone's right, as Seble was mentioning, that this is something that affects all of us. And, you know, and if we don't handle or take care of our mental health and protect it, eventually we might just be struggling with a mental illness. So there are examples of where corporate Canada has stepped up, you know, this $5 billion over 10 years that's coming in. There's campaigns that many of our organizations are running, you know, but it's in silos and it's not being scaled up nationally. So it's pockets of expertise happening here and here and there, but let's fund it adequately and scale it nationally.
I mean, there's also mental health first aid that came out of Australia that the Canadian Mental Health Commission has brought to Canada, and that's something that anyone can access, and it's just like regular first aid. How do I provide support if someone's in crisis and understand till they can get appropriate help? And it's, you know, to me, mental health training should always be mandatory. I see, you know, St. John's First Aid, if you're a lifeguard or you work with kids, you got to have this. But how many people work with people that are vulnerable from mental health issues and they don't have the training? So I think things like that are important for society to take a hold of as well.
And it takes towns and cities like Ajax to step up and say that we have to focus on mental health, you know. So if we could get that across the country where everyone makes this a priority area and we have a unified voice, that we'll get what we need and we'll be advocates and we'll get the respect and the funding that we deserve.
So I want to thank everybody was able to attend tonight in person and online, and can I have another big thank you for an incredible panel of speakers. I want to thank the Town of Ajax staff, volunteers, community partners, and Ajax residents, and don't forget Jay and Sarah. You guys, thank you. You're amazing. Every time I had a question, you were there, which is fantastic. So thank you for organizing this. You've created a night of engagement and an incredible conversation, and I know it doesn't end here. It's something that we have to take with us and have conversations with our families, with ourselves, with our politicians, and with our other political leaders. I invite you all to take this opportunity now to mingle, network, meet some of our presenters in the front lobby. We have some booths and resources out there for you from the region of Durham and Durham Mental Health. Thank you all for taking part in this conversation tonight. Let's keep it going. Please save the date. We have the next conversation with speaker series. It's Tuesday, February 26th on human trafficking. I'm sure it'll be another great event. So please enjoy the rest of the evening and drive safely, and thank you very much for participating.